this is how I know that you guys are such an unbelievably loving, caring church. I had 14 people come up to me to give me one of these. You guys are awesome. And everybody was like, "Are you okay this morning?" I'm like, "I'm actually doing fine. It's just my voice wasn't cooperating." So anyway, I am super excited to be able to start unpacking some very practical stuff. And in order to make it very practical, go back to, I'm going to talk you through for just a second. I didn't tell Linda I was going to do this. I hope that's okay. Go back to that page 8 for just a second. The personal prayer time, the personal devotional time that you're going to have later has these same questions written out on the page. So this is just another way of looking at them. And essentially, we're not going to have a chance to cover all of these. However, 3 of the middle columns are stuff that you can already tackle in your quiet time today. Even though we won't have gotten to some of the subjects until after your quiet time, you can do some of that later. But the middle one, use wisdom with a man. The middle one is what we're going to be talking about today. It's going to be understanding men. It's going to be understanding that regardless of whether you're married or dating or want to be dating, right? There's so many applications of this. And the key for all of these, you can see embrace a big picture understanding of life. That's more like what we talked about last night, okay? The eternal perspective behind really who we are. The third column is going to be stewarding your gifts from an eternal perspective. Take a pen and circle eternal. We talked last night about that there's a much bigger thing going on. And here's the key that will really help you as you pray this through. Again, you don't have to be using this as a tool. But if you do, look at these 3 rows. What am I already doing well? Where am I? Do I feel like I'm already following and fitting into what God has for me? So that you give yourself credit, because if you're already following God in an area, that's a good thing to recognize, and you can do it more often. That's a good thing. The second thing is, what do I most need to work on? Where was I convicted as we talked about certain things? What do I feel like God is speaking to me that would be good for me to work on and change? And then the third row is the really crucial one, which is what is essentially a really short-term action step or steps that I need to start to take now in order to get there. And the key for that, honestly, ladies, is to make it something measurable. Try harder is not a short-term measurable action step, right? It's like, okay, we talked about men today, and I'm going to do these 2 things for the next 2 weeks, for example, and just see what happens. And that's something that at the end of the 2 weeks, you'll know whether you did it or not. So that's essentially just a quick way you can use that. Now, we only have a few minutes to be able to dive into this topic of understanding men. And I really want to just jump in with the understanding that everything that I'm going to say, some of it may be surprising, some of it may not fit what you always thought, because so many of us come to this idea of understanding men with all these assumptions already built in and baked into our heads. I don't know where these ideas come from. I think it's like middle school, right? Where we close the door and talk about boys, right? Which is kind of what we're doing today, actually, now that I think about it. And we get all these ideas in our head about how men think, and a boy does something on the playground, and you're like, boys are so weird. Why did they do that? And then we go, oh, this is why. And we add this idea to our mental database of how guys think. And we don't realize that so many of the things we're thinking are wrong. Not all of them, certainly, but some of them. And so on top of those wrong assumptions, we build habits. And it makes so much difference to pull it all the way back to how has God really wired men, so that we can actually unlearn things that we need to, which won't be everything, but there will probably be some for each of us in the room, and rebuild some habits in order to really be thriving in the relationship. Now, by the way, let me just say this. This is, like I said, this is not just for the people in the room who happen to be married. If you're dating, like I said, if you want to be dating, this is incredibly important for understanding this from early so that you avoid some of the obstacles that can get in the way. Also, this applies in so many areas of life. How many women in the room have a son? Right? Yeah, it affects them too. How many of you work with a man? Right? See, men are everywhere. It's really, really crucial for us to understand this. Now, this is all based on the research from for women only. Okay, this is we're going to go fast, so just know if you're like, I don't know that I believe it. The numbers and sort of the statistics and all that kind of stuff of what percentage of men it applied to is in there. Now, that also reminds me, it's important for me to say, I'm going to be making generalizations. These are based on these massive nationally representative studies. We've spent almost $750,000, almost $750,000 over the last 15 years on all these different studies. We've interviewed and surveyed more than 20,000 men and women in order to be able to bring this really good, rigorous data. So this isn't our opinion. However, it is generalizations, right? If 75% of men said one way, 25% didn't, right? Yeah, we were all trying to add. What's 75? Yeah, 25% didn't, right? So there's always going to be exceptions. Everybody's an individual. The key is for you to look at your spouse, your boyfriend, your son, whatever, and go, is this maybe applying here? And that may be one of the things that's getting in the way, or becomes an opportunity for you to thrive much more because you understand each other. All right, so let's jump in. Some of the biggest things that we have found statistically that tend to cause issues in relationship, and they could be small little day-to-day issues that just end up creating a lot of irritations over time, or just little things every now and then, or they could be become big, huge issues in the relationship. It turns out a lot of it ties back to the fact that men and women tend to have very different insecurities, very different primary insecurities. And here is the primer on this. And I wish I had time to go into all the statistics and everything underneath it. Just know that these are all based on these big surveys. And these, like I said, by the way, just so you know, these are nationally representative. This was across all ages, all races, all religious backgrounds, in order, again, to be able to have a pretty good, rigorous understanding. So here tends to be our insecurity, our question as women. So you can see how different it is. For us as women, we tend to have the question, am I lovable? Right? Am I special? Am I beautiful? Am I worthy of being loved for who I am on the inside? Right? So we love to feel loved and cherished and adored. That's what lights us up, right? That's kind of what we think is the whole point of having the relationship. Like, if you're not going to feel loved, what's the point? And it's a big surprise to find out that for men, that's not the point at all. The men, their question was totally different. Their question was, am I able? Am I adequate? Do I measure up? Am I any good at what I do on the outside? Think about the difference. Am I worthy of being loved for who I am on the inside? Am I any good at what I do on the outside? Totally different. And it lends itself to a totally different set of primary needs. Now, to some degree, it's important to say this. To some degree, we're all insecure about everything, and we all need everything, right? Okay. This is the stuff that most tends to be the heartbeat and get in the way statistically. So let's talk about what this looks like. So for men, because the question is, am I able? That lends itself to needing something different than many of us as women naturally give or realize. The men on my survey said, if I had to make a choice, which, by the way, they wouldn't want to have to make this choice. Nobody would, okay? But they said, if I were forced to make this choice, I would give up feeling that my wife or my girlfriend loved me if I could just feel that she appreciates me, that she respects me, that she believes in me, that she trusts me, that she needs me. Those 5 things were so much more important to the average man that he would give up feeling that his wife loved him. Like, who are you people? Right? This is a big deal difference between men and women. And it gets us women into so much trouble because we women, we're really good at showing love. How ironic is that? Like, let me just ask a question. It's not going to be 100%, but I just like to always do little mini surveys when I'm with an audience. How many of you feel like with your spouse or a boyfriend or a child, how many of you feel that it comes out naturally to say the words, I love you? How many of you feel like it comes out naturally? It's not 100%, probably 80, 85%-ish, okay? So we say, honey, I love you. We do these things we hope he'll find to be loving. And at the same stinking time, without realizing it, we might be criticizing him a lot. Or maybe we're questioning his decisions all the time. Or maybe we're, I don't know, telling him what to do every now and then. Jeff and I do marriage conferences together. We were doing this big marriage conference just a couple weeks ago, and it was hilarious because I said this thing about, we might be telling him what to do. And of course, they're all sitting next to each other, right, as spouses or as partners, And you could actually see the men vibrating in their seats because they were trying so hard. They're going, I can't nod. I'm going to get in trouble if I nod, right? But we do sometimes, we'll tell them what to do, we'll do these things. Like, how many of you, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, how many of you left a child with a husband or a partner today and gave him a list of you're going to do this and 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 this, and at 10:30 there's this and this and this, and if they need a medicine, it's this one, not this one, right? We tell him what to do. Now, sometimes that's fine, but often it sends the message, no, you're not able. No, you're not adequate. And oh, by the way, what you did on the outside, it wasn't good enough. And it's actually kind of painful for a man. And we have no idea. And we would never intend to send a painful message. So in order to understand this, we really need to tackle 2 things about this particular thing. We need to understand what is it that sends that negative message so that we can avoid it, assuming that we want to, of course, right? So that we can avoid that negative message. And what is it that sends the positive message of how much I do appreciate you, right? What is it those avoiding the negative, sending the positive? So let's tackle avoiding the negative. It's, believe it or not, it is what sends that negative kind of painful message. It's hitting that raw nerve of insecurity. It's anything that says, I think what you just did is inadequate. I think you are inadequate. I think this thing you just did is inadequate. And it's little things. That's it. These little day-to-day things you would never think matter. Let me give you an example. So Fawn is my new best friend. She gave me a thermos of hot. Very nice. So I was on a plane flying back to Atlanta. We were actually just getting ready to film the DVDs that go with For Women Only and For Men Only, to do the, For Women Only or For Men Only or For Couples Only kind of studies. And I was on the plane flying back home to do this, and I need to confess, I interview every man I come across. I kind of feel bad for the man stuck next to me on the airplane for 2 hours, but If he's bored and he's reading Sky Magazine, he's fair game. Anyway, and so I was talking to this guy sitting next to me, and he asks this question, which always gives me the best opening line, because, so what do? You know, you have that awkward conversation. I say, I help women understand men. Ladies, you should see the expressions that I get when I tell men that. Because there's this, what are you going to tell them about us? Like, it's funny. Anyway, and we got into this conversation, and as he was talking about his relationship with his wife, his shoulders just kind of slumped, and he looked a bit defeated. I felt kind of bad, and he said a phrase that I had heard in previous years so many times from Jeff, and I had no idea what Jeff was talking about. And I can guarantee that some of us in this room have heard this and had no idea what our spouse was talking about. He said, look, I love my wife, but nothing I do is ever good enough for her. Right, we've heard this. Now, I thought I knew what he was talking about now that I, had done all this research. So I said, can you give me an example? And he said, yeah, I'll just tell you something that happened last night. We had friends over for dinner. The kitchen was kind of a wreck. She had to run out for a quick meeting. And she said, honey, would you be willing to clean the kitchen so when I come home, we can go right to bed? And he said, sure, no problem. He said, so I clean the kitchen. And she comes home from her meeting and kisses me on the cheek and looks over my shoulder into the kitchen and goes, huh, and grabs a sponge and starts re-cleaning all the countertops. And he said, it just kills me. Nothing I do is ever good enough for her. Now, I'm looking at some of your faces, and some of you are thinking the same thing I was thinking the first, 25 times I heard this, which is essentially internally we're like, dude, grow up. Like, you are so oversensitive. That should not bother you, right? Some of us are like, what? And here is finally what I realized as sort of the research went on. We are saying and thinking to ourselves, that should not bother you because it wouldn't bother me. He's not me, right? Wired very differently. Literally, some of this stuff that we're going to be talking about can actually be tied to the differences in brain wiring between men and women. And that is why I don't want to get into the whole are there genders kind of debate, which I know you guys are right in the middle of in California. But honestly, and I'm going to say this carefully, scientists know that's a ridiculous argument because you can look at the brain scans of men and women. And of course there are differences. Of course there's individuality. However, literally one neuroscientist said when you look at the brain scans of men and women, it's almost like looking at two different species. Like it's that different in some areas. So some of this comes down to that literally it's just a difference in wiring, different insecurities, different questions. We don't realize that when we go and re-clean all the countertops, what we're saying is, no, you're not adequate, and what you did on the outside wasn't good enough, you failed. And we wouldn't intend to send a message like that. We just have to get over the idea that our way, and I'm going to say this carefully, that our way is always right. Okay? Which, if you think about it, is a really ridiculous assumption, if you think about it. Okay. So that's how to avoid the negative message. It's to look for those little things that he is going to take as what you did on the outside wasn't good enough or you're inadequate, okay? Look for those things. Second piece of that, though, is how do you send the positive message? If you really want to convey that you do appreciate your man, what is it that you do differently? Now, we love, as women, we love to hear, I love you, right? Because it speaks to our question that it's 82% on the surveys, that 82% of women have as women, which is this am I lovable question. And you know how when your man says, honey, I love you, it says a multitude of things to you, right? It's not just, I have affection for you, right? It says, you're mine. It says, I would choose you all over again. It says all these things that build you up because it speaks to your question. So what do you tell a guy? Because I thought, well, I love to hear I love you. And my husband's greatest need is to know that I respect and appreciate him. So I start following Jeff around the house going, oh, honey, I respect you so much. Yeah, doesn't work. Finally, the poor guy was like, time out. Like, I know what you're trying to do, and I appreciate it, but it doesn't have the same ring to it. So literally, I went on this quest for multiple years to try to figure out, what can you say to a guy that has the same ring to it for him as I love you does for us? And finally, I don't have the book up here, but finally, when we were doing the survey for the Surprising Secrets of Highly Happy Marriages, one of the books, finally we found it on that survey. It's a small phrase. I think I might have told some of you this here when I was here in Mother's Day. So if you've heard me say this, don't shout it out, okay? But it's a small phrase, and I want you to guess what you can. Who said that? You, right. She got it the first time. Thank you. Okay, I was doing a marriage conference the other week, and a women's conference. And this woman yelled out from the back, "Let's have sex?" Like, that probably works too, but that wasn't what came out on the survey. So believe it or not, ladies, it's thank you. That says to a man exactly what he needs to hear to be filled up. And it's the little things. It's like literally, thank you for always getting up early in the morning and getting the coffee pot started, because I'm not good in the morning. Like, literally, thanks for changing the light bulbs, noticing the light bulbs were out. Thanks for putting gas in my car. Thanks for, I know you were so tired and you played with the kids after work anyway. You're such a good dad. Thank you. These little things, these little thank yous, here's what it's saying. It's saying, I noticed what you did on the outside, and it was good, and I appreciate it. It fills a man up in all the ways that he has questions, that he just doesn't know whether he really is good at what he does. Now, ladies, let's just emphasize before we wrap up this particular topic, why this matters so much again, okay? It's because men look very different on the outside than they feel about themselves on the inside. We think our men think they're all that, right? We think they look so confident, but that is not how they feel about themselves. On the inside, the way the guys described it as I was doing all these interviews is there's this deep vulnerability. There's this self-doubt, like I want to tackle a challenge. Yeah, like I want to be great, right? I want to be a good husband or a good salesman or a good father or whatever it is that I'm trying to do, but I'm really not sure that I know exactly what I'm doing, and I hope nobody finds out. There's this vulnerability. And it's interesting, when he does something, that it was actually really fascinating to hear that several of the men use the exact same word picture, totally independently. Like, one could be in California, one could be in Maine, one could be in Texas. Like, independently, these men were using several men used the exact same word picture. It was fascinating. This was what one of the things that they said, where he said, it's like when I've done something, like cleaning the kitchen. Okay, let's just use that example, okay? When I've done something, he said, inside, he's like, it was like being a little boy, like in kindergarten or first grade. And you know how, he said in kindergarten or first grade, you'd have a craft class, and you'd make ashtrays in craft class. Anybody under 35, we used to actually make ashtrays, believe it or not, in craft class. Like, anyone who's under 35 is looking at me horrified right now, but that's what we used to do, believe it or not. And he would say, these guys said, it's like I would make my ashtray, and it would be all misshapen, and it would be all wonky on one side. But I was bringing it home with like this beating heart to my mom and holding it up for her inspection, and so wanting to know that the most important woman in my life was pleased with me and pleased with what I did. And I'd hold it up to her, And what everything in me was hoping is that she would look at it and she would take it and go, oh, buddy, this is amazing. Great job. Not, it's all wonky on one side. And the guy said, we're still those little boys inside, holding up for inspection to the most important woman in our life, something we've done, and hoping that she'll say it's good. Now, the question that so many of us as women instinctively ask is, well, what if it wasn't good? Right? What if he didn't do a great job cleaning the kitchen, right? I know what y'all are thinking, right? Because we're all in the same place. Now, here's the reality is there's two. I started asking the men this. This part isn't in the book because I started this sort of avenue of study after this, the new editions of the book were published. So, but I've been asking the guys, okay, so what do we do if we disagree? What do we do if we think it wasn't sort of what we were looking for? What happens? And it's interesting that the answers came down to what I've started to call the next day rule. And there's two parts to the next day rule, okay, super practical. The first part is to ask yourself when you want to correct, you want to change, you want to say, but it wasn't, okay, ask yourself if what you're about to say is going to matter the next day. Is it essentially, this is the calculus that you're making. And this is going to sound so crazy, but remember, we're wired differently, okay? But the calculus you're making is it going to matter enough tomorrow that it's worth hurting my husband's feelings today? That's basically what you're asking. Is it going to matter enough tomorrow that it's worth hurting my husband's feelings or my boyfriend's feelings or my son's feelings today? And sometimes it is. Like I can remember there was a morning when Jeff, and this wasn't that long ago, where our son, he had to, there was something that he was doing with school, and he had to have a particular red T-shirt on. And Jeff had helped him, do a bunch of stuff getting ready. And he came downstairs, and I'm like, instead of, saying just, hey, thanks for doing what you did to help him get ready for this complicated thing, I was like, he's supposed to be wearing this particular shirt. Yeah, that's worth it because I don't want my son to be embarrassed either. Like to be able to say, oh, thanks so much, might have forgotten there's this shirt thing. And so that's worth it to mention it today. The second part of the next day rule, though, is if it's not, if it is important enough that it's worth hurting your husband's feelings, sort of hitting that nerve a little bit, that you're going to need to mention it. If at all possible, mention it the next day. The red shirt thing wouldn't work because that has to be mentioned right then. But a lot of the time, it's actually something that doesn't have to be mentioned right then. And literally let your husband have the triumph of whatever he was trying to do to make you happy, which is usually what it comes down to. He was usually trying to do something, holding up this thing for your inspection with his heart beating, and to be able to just say thank you, to be able to just tell him, great job. And if it's important enough to you, mention the next day, thanks again so much for doing this. Can I mention one thing, though? It's important for you to know this so you can do it better next time. So that, because I know that you want to be able to do whatever it is that you're doing in a way that works for all of us. Whatever it is, mention it if at all possible the next day. It's interesting, this thank you thing. This was such a mind-blowing thing for me because I realized how infrequently I actually say the words thank you, and how much I may be thinking thoughts of gratitude. I may be thinking, oh, that's so nice of him, and I realize how infrequently those words actually make it out of my mouth. It's funny, I was actually telling this group, I was doing this women's conference in Wisconsin right after we had found that out on the survey, right after we had found out the thank you thing. All right. That thermos doesn't like me. Look at that. I was doing this women's conference, and it was interesting. We didn't even have the book yet. Like, the survey had just barely come out. But I was so excited about it that I wanted to tell the women what we had learned. And so I said, guess what we just found on the survey? And I told them about this thing about thank you being a guy's equivalent to I love you. And this one woman, huge conference, it was about 1,000 women, this one woman kind of front and center, sort of where you're sitting, she popped up as I was saying this and marched out the door. And, sometimes, I know, sometimes things can be a little offensive. It's like, oh, sorry. It's interesting. She comes up to me at the book table after the session, and her eyes were so red. She hadn't been offended. She'd been convicted. And she said, I realize I never think to say thank you. And she said that morning, when she had left for the women's conference, that morning, she said, I passed my husband in the living room. He was up on a ladder installing a light fixture. And she's like, he'd been up there for a couple of hours, and he was sweating, and it might have been a 5 curse word job, one of those. And she's like, it didn't even occur to me to say thank you. I just waltzed by him on the way to the women's conference and said, bye, honey. And she's like, it didn't even occur to me to say thank you. And I ran out into the lobby, and I texted him, and I said, honey, thank you so much for putting up that light fixture. You know how much I've been wanting to have that fixed, and you always keep our house looking so nice and, do these things that matter to me. I really appreciate that. I'll see you. I love you a lot. I'll see you later. Something like that. Send, right? She comes up to me 5 minutes later after we had this conversation, and she tows me the text string back from her husband, and it says, who are you and what have you done with my wife? And she's like, I think I need to work on this. And I said, we all need to work on this, because we just don't realize just how much there is that little boy inside that is longing to hear this sense of appreciation and affirmation from us. Okay, real quick, I want to mention one other thing. I have about 8 minutes. I want to mention 2 things before we wrap up. So the next piece of the puzzle, we've talked about the emotional stuff that's under the surface. But there's also, and this is very much related to the brain wiring, there's also a difference in processing and communication that really gets in the way in our relationships. And you can often spot that difference is at work when you have this thought in your head. What was he thinking? Okay? Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but how many of us have thought, what was he thinking? Or said, maybe, what was he thinking, right? And here is what we don't realize is the translation of what was he thinking? It's, he wasn't thinking, right? That's the translation. That's what that means, sort of by definition, right? Here's what we have to know, okay? Guys think about everything. They just do it differently than we do. Because for us as women, if we're thinking about it, you know about it, right? And seriously, our brains are wired to be verbal processors. Literally, the corpus callosum, this is too much to get into, but the corpus callosum between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, in the male and female brains, it is structured completely differently. And the bottom line is that a lot of our processing is tied into the verbal centers of the brain. We are wired, in most cases, this is not everybody, the latest surveys that we've done, it was something like 78% of women, so about 28%-ish, a little bit, 22% different. But most women, we are literally wired to think things through by talking them through. That's the way that sort of comes most naturally for us. Men are exactly the opposite. It really is astounding that the human race has survived, if you think about it. Really, it really is. Men, by contrast, their brains are wired in such a way that it is actively difficult for most men to try to think something through while he's talking it through. Instead, he has to go underground and do this internal processing. And the way the guys described it was almost like an internal chess match, kind of, where there's this sense of, okay, if I do this, then this thing has to happen before, but if that happens, then I have to do this thing over here. And they do this internal processing sometimes for days about whatever it is, and it pops out the other end as a decision or a statement. And he says, I think we should do this. Now, we as women, we think this is the beginning of the conversation, right? Which it is. We have to start our processing, of course. And so we say, well, what about this? What about that? And the guy is thinking, I spent 3 days thinking about this, right? We didn't know, right? This is why we often do marriage conferences, so the guys can know how to work with our way. But here's the thing that really for us to know. When you see something that your man has done that you think, what on earth? Just stop and think to yourself, Shanti promises me he has a reason for this. And say, here's the difference. Instead of, why did you do that? Because the guys all said on the end of a why did you phrase, just add a comma, you dodo. Okay, that's the way the guys perceive it. Why did you do that, you dodo? If I need to ask why, though, I need to ask why, right? So what do I say instead? And it's, when you see the weird thing, it's instead of why, say, help me understand. I know that you've been thinking about this. I know you have a reason, whatever. Help me understand. It's automatically a more respectful way of approaching it. Let me give you an example of this. So we, hold on, my microphone is being weird. So we were speaking with some friends of ours who have a home group with a bunch of young couples and some really close friends, and they said, you know, would you be willing, we're going through for women only, for men only, would you be willing to come in and just, you know, share? And these are good friends, so yeah, sure. And so we were talking about this why did you thing, right? And how that can sometimes trigger this underground question like, she's challenging me, she doesn't appreciate me, whatever. What was he thinking? And when we said that, our friend, I heard my friend, the husband, kind of behind my shoulder, I heard him go, and of course, I turned and I looked really quickly, and I see him and his wife, who was across the room, I see them go, you know, do one of those looks. I'm like, clearly there's a story here you want to share with the class, you know, just wanted to sort of dive into that one. And he's like, yeah, okay. And so the night before, she had a friend's birthday party or something, and so he was home with their 3 young children. They had a 5-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a baby. So he was at home with the kids. She comes home from the party, and she looks in the fridge, and she says, you know, honey, why did you give the kids juice instead of milk at dinner? And he said, and I got angry, and she got defensive, and it went downhill from there. And I'm like, okay. So James, you know, help us understand what was the thinking. And he said, well, I looked in the fridge and I saw there was only this much milk in the carton, and I was going to give it to them for dinner, but then there wouldn't be enough for breakfast the next morning, and so I was going to go to the grocery store to get more, but the baby was already asleep. We've been having a terrible time with her sleep schedule, so I didn't want to wake her up. So I figured I'd give the kids juice, but I'd dilute it with water by half because, you know, sometimes the sugar will get in the way, and sometimes if the 2-year-old has any sugar, she'll wake up in the middle of the night regardless, but we've learned I can just rub her back and she'll go right back to sleep, and so that's what I was thinking. And you saw his wife go, because she really had been thinking you dodo, right? And so it's really crucial for us to realize we may not always agree. You don't have to agree with the decision matrix, with the thought process, but just realize that usually there is actually a reason. They've usually thought stuff through. And so it is so different when we approach it with that assumption in mind rather than the assumption that, let's just say this out loud, somebody was an idiot. Okay? You could see how that would actually be a very difficult assumption. It would get in the way. Okay, I only have a couple of minutes. Let me mention, what do you do about all of this if you realize, man, there is a need to reset the relationship. What do I do? Especially if, okay, you say my husband needs to know that I appreciate him, but I'm not sure that I do. You know, he's hurt me, or there's these issues. What do you do? And Linda mentioned the 30-day kindness challenge. So I am just going to mention this briefly and tell you what it is. You can see more in the kindness challenge actual book, or you can actually go to the website. We had a ministry sponsor step forward and create this whole website system where you can actually sign up for 30 days of reminder emails to do this process. It's called jointhekindnesschallenge.com. Jointhekindnesschallenge.com. Here's what the 30-day kindness challenge actually is, and it is really remarkable. It's not, by the way, just for a romantic relationship. You can do this with anybody. You can do it with your child, your difficult colleague that you want a better relationship, your mother-in-law, right? Anybody. Okay, so we have some issues to talk about. So, here's what the 30-day kindness challenge actually is. You pick that person that you want a better relationship with, and let's just say it's your husband, okay? For 30 days, you're going to do 3 things every day for 30 days. First, you say nothing negative about that person, either to them or about them to somebody else. Nothing negative. I hear all the women there go, oh, okay. Nothing negative. If I am in a difficult season with my husband, think about it for a minute. If I am in a difficult season with Jeff, I can be pretty polite to him, but if I go to my girlfriends at work and I'm like, you would not believe what he did the other day, I don't realize it, but I am sabotaging how I feel about him. And oh, by the way, I'm actually training myself to be an unkind person. Like, I don't think of it that way, but that's what I'm doing. Okay, so that's the first thing, nothing negative. Second thing, every day for 30 days, find one thing you can sincerely praise about this person. You can sincerely affirm and tell them and tell somebody else. So I can't complain about whatever it is I thought Jeff was doing, but I'm looking for things to praise. And so I say, thank you so much for stepping in with our daughter who's in college, who is just, I couldn't talk to her about whether she's going to try to get an internship this summer. You know, she's promised she'll earn some money to help us pay for housing, and you know, it's like this big emotional thing because now she doesn't want an internship. Thank you so much, honey, for stepping in and having that conversation with her, because she wasn't listening to me. And that is a word of praise for him, an affirmation, how much I appreciate that. And then I go to my girlfriends the next day at work, and I'm like, you know what Jeff did yesterday? We were having such a difficult time with our daughter, and he stepped in, and what am I doing as I look for those things to praise? I'm putting Philippians 4:8 in action. Philippians 4, Paul basically is talking to a group of people who's persecuted, and he says this. He says, rejoice. I'm going to say it again, rejoice. And it's like, okay, dude, you're in prison, you're chained to a wall. And you're talking to a persecuted church. How do you rejoice in a prison? How do you rejoice in a difficult marriage? How do you rejoice when you've got this issue with your mother-in-law or whatever? And God gives us the prescription just a couple of verses later. He says, okay, here's what you do. You think on whatever is lovely. You think on whatever is excellent. You think on whatever is worthy of praise rather than what's worthy of driving you crazy. And it's astounding. You will see your feelings start to change, okay? Every day for 30 days. Finally, third thing, every day for 30 days, is to do a small action of kindness, a small action of generosity for that person, okay? And it's amazing. This can be anything. We think of acts of kindness as being kind of the random acts of kindness thing, like you pay for the people in the beat-up car behind you in the drive-through line, right? And that's an act of service. And acts of service can be acts of kindness or generosity, but that's not the only type. Any action of generosity counts. I'll give you an example. I did the 30-day kindness challenge for our daughter, who was 16 at the time. This was 2 years ago, who was 16, but I knew she'd be going off to college, And she's a great kid, but she could roll her eyes with the best of them. And my head wanted to explode, right? And I really wanted a better relationship with her before she goes off to college. So I did the 30-day kindness challenge for her. And in action of generosity, I realized for her, when she would come running into my home office and I would be sitting there working at my computer on a deadline or something, and she'd say, hey, Mom, would you watch this little YouTube video with me, right? And I would usually say, in an hour, honey. Now, an action of generosity for her in that moment is to take my attention off of what I'm doing and put it on her in that moment when she's excited about it, not an hour later. That's an action of generosity. Do find those things that you flow in naturally. You're going to find that there are gifts that God has given you in kindness and generosity that you flow in. And do those regularly. So those three things. Don't say anything negative, either to or about. Find the one thing that you can praise or affirm. And do the action of generosity every day. And what we found is that 89% of relationships improved. 89%. Which is huge. We don't see those kinds of numbers in social science. But if you think about it, it kind of makes sense that 89% of relationships would improve, because really what's happening is you're impacting the other person and you're kind of changing the temperature of the relationship. But if you think about it, the biggest thing that you're doing is you're totally changing you, right? So it makes perfect sense that 89% of relationships would improve. So ladies, listen. I could go on about this all day. I hope you've gotten some really practical stuff. The key for us to understand most about men in our romantic relationship, especially with a spouse, came at the very, very end of the survey, where we asked the men, what's the one most important thing you wish your wife knew, but feel you can't explain to her or tell her? And I thought it would be a chance for the men to vent. We gave them a blank space, and I was going to sort of order the things that they said. And instead, when I got their responses back, I almost started crying. Because the top response, by far, the one most important thing I wish my wife knew is how much I love her. This is how our men feel about us, ladies. We just didn't necessarily always know. They have such goodwill towards us. So it's a great opportunity for us to have goodwill back. All right?